Well, hi, Mark.
Hey, Jeremy.
It's time to record an intro for AI Week, and we're here talking about AI and code. Our goal for this special topic of the Critical Code Studies Working Group is to solicit as wide a range of possible different experiences, perspectives, and insights into the intersectionality of contemporary AI and code. Um, Perspectives that our members of the working group have that we may not, but we'll be kicking this off by exploring some topics to get the conversation started. Um, what do AI and code have to do with each other at this moment, and what does that tell us about critical code studies? So Mark and I have brainstormed a list of topics and questions to share with each other in an informal conversation. And I think our last version of these headlines was uh, intentional writing, code and accessibility, the role of the detail in code interpretation, and interpreter personas. But we'll see where this conversation takes us. Mark, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So one thing that comes up when we talk about AI and critical code studies, if AI starts writing a lot of the code, and if a lot of critical code studies deals with thinking about the people who wrote the code, does using those systems seem like it interrupts a crucial part in the meaning making that code studies people are going after? What do you think
Right.
about that?
Yeah, why read something as if it was authored if it wasn't authored, right? And I think when I think about the history of objections in critical code studies to reading the code, I think about the objection of scope, saying it's millions of lines of code written by dozens of people. Um, why pay attention to an object at that scale as if it were a poem or a novella? And then I also think about this kind of history of code generation and compiling and transpiling, where someone says, well, the code is this artifact at the top layer, but then it becomes the machine code or the assembly code, or it becomes voltage differences on a disk. So why read this top layer when you could read down? Um, I think that in some ways this AI code generation, it will sometimes break chains of meaning, but to me, it's actually still always part of these networks of intention. People are writing these prompts, they're reviewing and then intentionally deploying the things that kind of come out. And so there are still these signifiers that end up circulating in the world, and we can read them. But
Yeah,
I don't
I
know.
think
What do you think?
that's a good. Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. I mean, I think if we just extend on what we've had before, if we've had IDEs that are out there and that help people to develop code, like NetBeans on out, or whatever
Hmm.
Eclipse or whatever people were using back in the day that would auto generate big chunks of code for them or templates that they would then customize.
Framework.
It feels like this is more continuous than a break from that. I think what makes me excited about it is it might mean that people who before um, wouldn't even think to produce code might now go to a copilot or might go to ChatGPT or whatever and might start generating code. So we might actually have more code out there in the world by a broader group of people who otherwise might not have had access. Um,
So that accessibility question, I mean, it's the exciting part isn't the more code part, it's the more different kinds of code authors part, right? Like
sure.
that's the code by elementary school students, code by dispossessed or underrepresented populations, um uh uh code by bespoke language models. In other words, if people are authoring the systems that are authoring the code, is that also an interesting chain for interpretation?
Oh, 100%. And of course, if more people have access to writing the code at the same time, they're probably going to have access to reading the code with these tools. And I feel like you've thought a little bit about that. about
Well, that's the exciting part for me is actually I think what you're right that code generation is there are many new ways of doing it, but it's somewhat old hat. We've had a lot of code generation for a very long time. And this has upped and changed the stakes, but it's not a difference in kind. Whereas code interpretation is not something that has been widely available. I don't think most people know that they could just go to ChatGPT and paste in a bit of code they found in their life world and then just say as a non-programmer, could you please explain this to me? But that's the beginning of potentially something that all caveats about hallucination, and this is not a computer science degree, right, etc. But
well, and my biggest concern, when a little bit of information, is I've proven often in my life, is a dangerous thing. There's the hallucination, and then if you don't know the language, you don't know where it's hallucinated, and then suddenly fiction becomes fact, and we go on out. So I mean, again, but that I think that'll just prove even more usefulness for people who are interested in critical code studies, to sort of like poke around that and how understanding develops in lots
yeah,
of
I
different
mean,
languages.
the fact that people might feel empowered to ask the questions at all,
Yeah.
right? Like we have to be there before we can start talking about reliable answers and best practices for getting the responses that you have. Um, this thinking critically about your sources of how a piece of code works, when considered in detail, or what it means or why. That's the luxury of someone who feels that they're able to ask at all without, you know, a 4-year degree or an intensive training camp.
I mean, I think that's exciting. And to go back to a point you made earlier, there was this moment, I think it was like 2008 at Digital Humanities, where Lev Manovich said, okay, critical code studies people, does this mean that I have to read the entire code body of, I don't know, Microsoft Paint if I'm going to write about that, or Photoshop if I'm going to write about that? And I've had the pleasure of being on some dissertation committees, Dan Cox and Bryce Jackson, who do very large scale, like one does WordPress, one does a Twine version, very large scale software analyses. But
Right.
I do like
Big
this
code.
idea of getting to be able to say, hey, LLM, um, this is something we were talking about the other day. Here's my research question. Can you point me towards some code that I might want to talk about if these are my research this giant body, like summarize what these sections do, compare this to a big thing for me is like compare this to what might be typical in this code. Is there something atypical that shows up? But in any
Right.
case,
What's
having
interesting.
something that's helping you do that initial search for the details of where you're going to spend your energies.
Yeah, that kind of if it's true that many interesting bodies of code are enormous, then in addition to kind of keyword searching, since so much code is actually semantic and syntactical. It's kind of the way it's shaped, not necessarily the keywords that it's made out of, that might be the most important thing. Then, yeah, if you look at something like Claude and say, I can upload a kind of a novel's worth of code and then ask a question about just that document in this session. Um, then you could start imagining something where instead of Control F, we have this kind of conversation that says, point me towards things that I should be spending my time looking at. And that could be um, a shift for a generation of scholars who um, feel empowered to take on larger objects, right? They're not just writing about, 1 to 3 page code poems and little tiny, JavaScript applets anymore, because it doesn't seem ambitious to them to explore.
Now, here's a question, and we've got some folks coming up in next week who've written on this question, namely Lai Chi Fan, Rita Rayleigh, and Minhua, and also David Barry. But
Mhm.
these LLMs, these AI machine learning software algorithms models are going to be things that we're going to want to study from a code point of view. There's that some of this is beyond our reach. Some of it's or the computer scientists reach. They like to black box it. They some of it seems we're wrestling with the explainability question. Where do you think there's some hope for critical code studies having some making a dent in that world?
Well, I mean, I think Rita Ray and Minois have made a dent, and I think other, Dave Berry has made it. So there are dents. There may be parts of black boxes that are intractable, although some people are designing more introspectable LLMs as a design goal. They say, I want to still make this process work in a way that then I can explain inputs and outputs in a way that's more logical. Um,
Mm.
but my suspicion is that really, even if parts of the black boxes remain intractable, they are still part of a chain of meaning. And that suggests that critical code studies in the future may be also very concerned with um, prompt engineering and persona design and like the transcripts of LLM sessions, which are involving managing inputs. And because we actually want custody over the chain of meaning that produces the code in order to introspect on it. That'll be important to a lot of people who aren't CCS scholars. But right now, a lot of these inputs are ephemeral and people
Yeah.
go through the process and then they throw them away and then keep the code at the end. But that's not necessarily the most interesting part about the code is just what was generated.
Oh, I love it. I love it. So you're reminding me of Catherine Griffiths, who's part of the Hacks Lab, who has designed some software approaches to visualizing what's going on in machine learning algorithms. We should keep her in mind. I'm also thinking about I I I think it would be delightful if people start asking LLMs to generate code in the style of particular programmers. Um, there would be like the Dijkstra. There's no go-tos anywhere in it. There's some beautiful code from Knuth. I don't know people. I don't know who they would call upon. Some Ada Lovelace, if they can. But I feel like you had some other day. You mentioned to me the other day about the role of personas in of evoking these personas for the act of using LLMs in interpretation of code. What was that idea?
Well, when we think about humanities interpretation, it's often situated. You say, I have this perspective, I have this background, I have these ethics, I have this set of concerns. Maybe it's uh, theoretically articulated where I say, right now I'm being Marxist or feminist or a queer theorist, right? And so my practices are tied up in my ethics and in my perspective. And so I'm going to interpret like this, right? Like right now, I'm being a post-colonial eco-critic, right? Um, and so I think we can think about personas and prompt engineering in this way of articulating a position. And instead of saying, hey, machine, I abdicate to you the process of exploring this code and telling me what is interesting or explaining to me uh, what it means and why. Instead, you say, hey, let's have a conversation about who I am and why I care about this code. And over the process of this conversation, you are going to become a token string generator that is more aligned with the contingent process of interestingness that we are inventing. And then I'll see what you find. And sometimes it will be, garbage and sometimes it'll prompt interesting next steps, but it will arise out of that articulating a position.
Which sounds more cyborg or collaborative than instrumental in our
Was
relationship
this,
to
I
the
mean, I think for you, this is how you've been thinking about LLMs in pedagogy, right? Like, when you're thinking about bringing an LLM into a workshop or into a classroom or into a grant project, are you thinking of it as a resource or a device, or are you thinking of it more as like an interlocutor, like a chatbot?
That is a great question. And I think it, if I'm co-authoring with it, it's interlocutor, but I think above all, it's like laboratory space, experimental zone. Now, I Jeremy, these people aren't going to watch us forever, so we got to stop and open up the conversation to the rest of them.
No, no, no. This is just the beginning of talking about CS and AI, not the end. And for all the eighth biennial Critical Code Studies 2024 participants, thank you for joining us for this brief chat. And we're really looking forward to your threads, your ideas, your perspectives. What is at the intersection of AI and code, and what might this tell us about critical code studies today? We'll see you in the working group.